I now welcome you formally to the HELSUS Global South Encounters. I am Franklin Obenyodum. I'm currently Associate Professor of Sustainability Science with Global Development Studies. I will chair today's encounters. If you would like to stay connected between the encounters, I would like to draw your attention to our new Twitter account and Just Ecological Political Economy, the HELSUS Global South blog, links to which you can see in the chat box. Sustainability science is not a field of books, so it is important to begin today's book discussion by reflecting on what my colleague, Dr. Damjana Ganta, editor-in-chief of the journal Urban Change, describes as, quote, the science of writing. Ganta tries to describe, quote, that indescribable feeling of staring at a blank page right before typing the first word. That first word is also the first step on the long journey to publication, unquote. The writing of books is an even more exacting process, a laborious undertaking. So arduous is the process that regional studies that lead in journal once organized a book symposium in which a range of book views were canvassed with titles such as why write books and why one idea is sometimes not enough. The contributors showed their pride as authors. Annalie Saxenian from the University of California, Berkeley, for instance, argued that, quote, if an article is a mile, a book is a marathon, and sometimes several marathons, unquote. Therefore, throughout history, aphorisms have been crafted to capture the pain and pleasure of writing books. Do not judge a book by its cover is one of them. Literally, one cannot dismiss a book by how it looks. The writing is so painful on the one hand and so pleasurable on the other that book ideas must be read, appreciated, even applauded. They can be dismissed, sometimes brutally so. One reviewer is said to have written that a book under review was, quote, beyond the boundaries of permissible ignorance, unquote. But in that case, we need to be sure that the critics have indeed read the book, done so carefully, and appreciated it. In her book, The Coming of Age, Simone de Beauvoir, the great feminist, urges her readers to help her to shatter the silence over the subject matter of her book. These sentiments have been made by both, or have been expressed by both evolutionaries and revolutionaries. In the general theory of employment, interest, and money, the great evolutionary economist J.M. Keynes noted, and I quote, the composition of this book has been for the author a long struggle of escape, and so must the reading of it be for most readers if the author's assault upon them is to be successful, a struggle of escape from habitual modes of thought and expression. The ideas which are here expressed so laboriously are extremely simple and should be obvious. The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones, which ramify for those brought up, as most of us have been, into every corner of our minds. End of quote. Revolutionaries have little in common with evolutionaries, but on this point about the need to take books seriously and engage them carefully, Karl Marx, in essence, agreed with Keynes. Marx noted in the preface to the French edition of Capital, Volume 1, in quotes, that is a disadvantage I'm powerless to overcome, unless it be by forewarning and forearming those readers who zealously seek the truth. There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. End of quote. Writing books on the Global South, especially if the author is from the Global South, even when the author lives and works in the Global South, in the Global North, arguably requires more grit. The struggle by Frantz Fanon to find a publisher is well known, but that is not an isolated case. Southern writers, even if they live and work in the Global North and their identities cannot easily be defined in black and white terms, face extreme barriers. In her book, Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas, Sylviane Diouf recounts the enormity of hurdles she had to overcome to write that book. In the end, it took a tectonic and titanic tragedy, 9/11, to get a book out of her typewriter. Global South writers are usually invisible. In his book, The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison describes the feeling among his own people, mainly working class, unemployed or underemployed. The invisible man is not understood. Why should a healthy man be bookish, not a builder or a bartender or an undertaker? Among the outside group, the invisible man is incompetent, even inferior in his scholarly pursuits. For the invisible, therefore, writing a book is particularly challenging. The pain and pleasure could not be more magnified. That is why the Global South Encounters would typically invite the author or authors of major books on the Global South for an encounter. These books are not just about the Global South, they are seen as part of sustainability science or sustainability research itself. As my colleague Sala Sariola suggests in her own book with Bob Simpson, Research as Development, the books in the Global South Encounters see research as sustainability. The books must also relate to either the specific Global South Encounters theme of the year or the vision and values of HELSUS Global South more broadly. So these books attempt to, in the words of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, decolonize methodologies to contribute to the process of promoting just change and just sustainabilities, as Julian Ageman has theorized. This year's book is Farming as a Financial Asset. It engages the financialization debates, but transcends them to much wider fields, including ecological imperialism, the theme for the Global South Encounters this year, even if the author of the book has not himself set out to do so. Fundamentally, the book puts the case for using land to explain financialization. Reviews of the book have appeared in leading journals such as Economic Geography, Economic Sociology, Journal of Agrarian Change, Review of Agriculture, Food and Environmental Studies, and Society and Natural Resources. A book review symposium was also dedicated to the book at the major geography journal Dialogues in Human Geography. So this is clearly a fitting book based on which we can close this year's discussion on ecological imperialism. This magnum opus has been authored by a very fine scholar, Stefan Ouma, professor of economic geography at the University of Bayreuth, a member of the editorial collective of Antipode, a leading critical geography journal. Professor Ouma will set out his key arguments. He will use Tanzania, New Zealand, and elsewhere in Africa and Asia to illustrate his treatise. For critical comments, we have three thoughtful scholars and activists working in the theories and case study areas. Dr. Anna Sturman works on New Zealand. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Sydney Environment Institute, the University of Sydney in Australia. Dr. Mariko Frame, a specialist on Tanzania and elsewhere in Asia and Africa, is assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Merrimack College in the US. And Dr. Joseph Yaro, who works on Ghana and elsewhere in Africa, is professor in the Department of Geography and Resource Development at the University of Ghana. Welcome to you all. For the audience, our practice is to mute our microphones, unmuting only when I invite you to do so. But questions can be sent to me in the personalized chat box. And at this stage, Professor Ouma can now set out the contours of his tour de force. Stefan, over to you.
Thank you, Franklin. Professor Obengodum, it's a real honor to be here. Do you hear me? Just to be on the safe side, can you confirm?
Yes.
And
yes.
Do you see only one slide as well?
No.
No?
We see two.
You see two. Then let me just change this. Now you should see one, right?
No, we still see two.
Strange. You should see one, actually. Still two?
Yes.
Let me then.
Yes. Okay. Oh no. No, you share it.
Let me then do it again.
Okay.
One or two?
Two.
Okay, now it should be one.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Finally.
So thanks to everybody for setting this up. Franklin, the organizers in Helsinki, but especially also Mariko, Anna, and Joseph for engaging with my work. It's a real pleasure. And I've known Joseph for some time, so I know his work, and I know what I can take from his work and would take from his work in the past, but I have not really engaged with the work of Mariko and Anna before this, and I just said, why am I so late to this? So it's always expanding your horizon, these types of events, and I'm very grateful for this and take much away from it. In a nutshell, about 10 minutes, the presentation of the book. This is the book, it's open access, and you can download it and use it. But the book has been translated into a living website, Institutional Landscapes, and we just published our very first guest contribution on following the money in the case of Brazilian agri-investments. So I welcome anyone who has a more keen interest in the nexus between global finance and agriculture farming to approach me if you want to contribute. So this is much larger than my own modest contribution. Don't care about these numbers, just take those visual clues that show you that something has increased. So since 2005, we have seen a rising interest amongst financial investors in farmland. We can separate the actual land, the very dark line, from a private equity, which is another category where you buy stakes in companies. Often this is overlapping, but the data differs, so it makes sense to combine different sorts of data. But what you see, there has been a tremendous increase in the number of farmland or private equity funds catering for these domains. And the world of agricultural finance shown by the columns is actually much larger than just farmland and private equity. So if you bring in venture capital, listed equities and whatnot, it's a whole different story. So Key drivers have been pension funds. So here you see countries in light gray with pension funds investing in farmland somewhere else. In dark, you see targeted countries by pension funds who invest in farmland and agricultural productions. And the mid shade gray is countries that are both sources and targets of pension fund investments. And you clearly see that this is not just a global South phenomenon, as we often assume, the land grab literature has often made this case that Wall Street is buying up farmland in the global North, but you can look into Germany, Australia, Canada, and see some of these very processes unfolding. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, one of my case studies is actually has been a major frontier as well. And I was really puzzled, and I'm here depending on Anna to give me a bit more context. As someone from the region, I was really puzzled that New Zealand has been virtually left out of all debates on the global land grab. There are hardly any papers dealing with it, which is quite strange given the sheer size of investments. I also want to be fair and really recommend that you read this book alongside the book of Madeleine Fairburn, Fields of Gold, because they are really complementary. They sometimes attend to the same thing, but they make many other different points, and reading them together is a rich, I hope, rich experience. What is my book tackling? O is Ouma, F is Fairburn. So I reacted a little bit to the lacking historical depth in the current literature with the book. Often there has been a macro focus, very abstract deductive, which is not a bad thing, but it has always been about finance capital going to farmland, and few people actually have talked to the finance capitalists. That would be an example. Capital is also often imagined as homogeneous, pre-configured. So my point was more, let's open the capital accumulation process. Like the labor process, we can open it up and see what is going on. There's a politics of data and information that most people don't really write about. How can we actually generate knowledge about a field that is very closed and secretive? I also thought it would really be nice to work across geographies. So as somebody who worked in East Africa before and who has family in Kenya and then did his PhD in Ghana, where I met Joseph, I had this focus on different parts of Africa, but I also wanted to bring in something new. So this is how New Zealand then came in as a case study, and some other factors contributed to this. I also wanted to look into how financial markets actually operate and into the normative and moral glue that ties this industry together to understand how they incorporate land into their own world-making machinery. And then eventually I wanted to find out what happens on a financialized farm. So one premise was I wanted to move beyond the micro-macro divide. There are some really good offerings. The Operations of Capital framework by Mesadre and Nielsen is something I find very valuable, because it's still about capital, it's still about structures and systems, but it's also about operations, something very practical. But there's also this phrase of the micro-funded political economy of the investment chain and the moral glue that holds it together by Brown. So I tied these together and turned it into something more geographical, which I call institutional landscapes. And this is a heuristic that not just attunes us to the reality that institutional investing, global asset management, delegated rule-based money management shapes the world around us. This is just a fund example. You don't have to follow the details, but this shows you a very complex fund structure that links a fund in Europe with investment in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But there's also something else, and history comes in here. This was very dear to me. There has been good historical research about even institutional investment in farmland, not just financial investment, even institutional investment. And one report called The Landscapes of Institutional Landowners from '79, never cited in any land rush or land grab paper, was very key for me here. And this was on the UK. So I use this supported with a materialist notion of landscape as a heuristic, as an entry point. And the key thing in this kind of global ethnography that combines case studies from Tanzania, New Zealand, but also took me to many other places, is to go to the farms themselves and see what is actually happening on a farm turned financial asset. Obviously, this is a methodological challenge, as you can imagine, but I at least tried a bit. So the synthesis of this book, and I take you briefly through there, is what are institutional landscapes after the book for me? Popped up or supported with the empirical material I generated. I would say they are an expression of the expansion of a global return society, whereby the reproduction of the better off people of the global north and increasingly the global south has become tied to the reproduction of financial capital, both domestic and abroad, like the teachers or professors, retirement funds from the US investing somewhere in southern New Zealand, for instance. The concept sensitizes us for the fact that assumingly higher forces, financial markets, materialize in the material environment around us. So there's a political ambition here, basically also helping us to grapple with the question, who owns what and how can we make this visible and the flows that link to this pattern. Institutional landscapes are very much about a financial value form of land. And this realization requires concrete and future-oriented interventions in the world of agriculture or other domains of life. It basically entails a synchronization of the world of agriculture with the conventions and capital demands of investors. But this is very frictional and a conflict-prone undertaking, and the book partly attends to that. They are a product of landscaping practices, so something what people do, people we can talk to, we can observe, we can follow, which often, however, we cannot trace empirically very easily because maybe those people don't let you in. And institutional landscaping creates different social natures, which reflect the financial value character of the asset to be. They often incorporate old agrarian landscapes like this socialist state farm in Tanzania that then became a private equity-run farm, and they thrive on them. Sometimes the legacy of the past provides a particularly cheap or accessible asset to global capital. And in order to carve out financial value from the human and non-human world, institutional landscapes are multi-layered products of multiple histories and forces, including the visible and less visible hand of the state. And to close here, they are a product of global value relations constituted by connections between different place-based operations. So I really want to also visualize these connections and the value flows to the extent it's possible that are part of them. And they cannot be conceived without, and here ecological imperialism comes in, the imperial needs of those whose capital has contributed to the very existence of institutional landscapes in the very first place. And often the roots of this capital behind institutional landscapes lead back right into the middle of society. So this is very important. On the website, you can check this out for Aotearoa New Zealand, pension funds investments in New Zealand. So it is not big Wall Street people, you know, the elites that sit in those towers who then buy up farmland. It is often asset managers that sit in less illustrious places, and they administer the people of well-off middle-class people. I think this is also a corrective, and it eventually relates to a kind of imperial mode of living that much of the global north, not just financial elites, are actually involved in. So I think this is what I have to say in a nutshell about the book. And I would really like to thank you. And the thank you, of course, has no source, just my own mouth at the moment. But yeah, so looking forward to hear more.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for an informative and inspiring talk. But it cannot, of course, be complete without inviting insightful comments from Anna, Joseph, and Mariko in that order. So many thanks, and the floor is now open for Anna first.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that overview, Stefan. I enjoyed reading your book so much and was frequently reading it in public places and like gasping and like scribbling things down, and people looked at me funny, but I was really, really into the story that you were weaving. So as you mentioned, I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I wrote my PhD thesis on the political economy of climate change and agriculture. So I have a very specific way of coming at this, and I am going to use that lens to talk about the ideas that you work through in your book, which is not to say that I didn't really enjoy it, but I'm just going to go in there with a particular concern or critique that I found sort of coming through over and over again. Okay, so I noted that a really interesting part of the book, or a key aspect of farming as financial asset, that could create some tensions for readers who are looking for strategic direction for what to do about the processes that you're talking about and the relationalities that you unpack. A tension there potentially is the decision you've made to remain at the level of the moral aspects of building financialization on top of farming as an ongoing concrete activity. And here I do have specific reference to Aotearoa in New Zealand as opposed to the comparative case studies. So I thought that while the book is concerned with defetishizing the processes of assetization and financialization in a really useful way, and in a way that accords with a broadly historical materialist agenda, it tends to swing towards the post-structural political economy traditions. And I know that some of the people you spoke to from New Zealand are quite bound up in that area in our country. So that approach centers the normative as ultimately stabilizing, and it tends to lead away from the exploration of labor relations while remaining broadly descriptive of the asset-owning classes. And here I'll just talk very briefly about the double movement, the Polanyian double movement, and how I think we could maybe trouble it a little bit to extend your already excellent analysis. So as we all know, Polanyi was concerned with the disembedding of the market from human society, human society. And this precept serves as foundational for much post-structural political economy and adjacent theorizing. And again, as we know, Polanyi didn't explicitly ground this account of the double movement in a critique of capitalist social relations for a whole lot of reasons, but we won't go into the historiography of it. But it means that his approach operates above the oppositions, so labor and capital, that structure the Marxist theory of capital's internal propulsion. And all relationality with land is labor, whether exploited or appropriated, right? So it's always there. And absent this historically specific account of agents motivated through these inherent contradictions and the crisis tendencies, the post-structural political economy approach can tend towards flattening the phenomena that they're describing and sort of paying attention to normativities and morals more than the expansive understanding of what's going on. So it also tends to suggest some sort of essentialist pre-capitalist society that we're trying to just reflexively make our way back to, which I know, you're so attentive to the historical detail of the state in particular and financialization over time. So I think we could take it even further. anyway, that basic argument about morals and normativities being the ultimate stabilizers of financialization or assetization builds to this idea that by convincing enough people that these processes shouldn't happen or these things shouldn't be constructed, then they won't be. And it places NGOs as the central actors there. And I think there's obviously some validity to that, but it tends to veer away from looking at the day-to-day struggles at the level of production required to rebuff capital. And so here, I just want to be really clear, specifically, how does the construction of normative acceptance of the assetization of farms connect to the stabilization of this as a concrete process? Because confidence in boardrooms and financial conferences is one piece of it, and it's an important piece that we don't often get to see. But what does all of that matter to anyone else? What does that matter to, you know, the new labor forces that will be brought in to do the agroecological transitions? How does that connect to the financial services workers? And thinking there of like the way Matt Huber brings that in with oil. So I'm not going to take up too much more time because I know that I've gone on a little bit. But I've said here, a more rewarding endeavor perhaps than placing our faith in a relatively ephemeral public as channeled through NGOs, may be to return the focus to the class relations implicated in these attempts to create farming futures, both new ones, so the financial services workers, and the old, the question of labor relations in capitalist agriculture, the agrarian question, which has never gone away, and the links between them. How might these labor forces be involved in the contestation of the financial commodity frontier, and welding this incredibly fine-grained picture of how assetization is proceeding to a return to class analysis builds toward the ecological imperialism literature, right? Like towards the Foster and the Burkett, Clark, Moore, Mallow, Fraser, all of them, Smith, O'Connor. Yeah, so I think you gave me so much to think about. I enjoyed it so much, and I'm definitely going to be citing the hell out of you for the next few years, I'd say. So thank you for this opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Anna. I think Mariko, if you're ready, please, you may now take the virtual floor or the microphone.
Nice to see you in person, Stefan. I really enjoyed reading your book. I also had the same reaction because I've done some work on ecological imperialism and finance, and I was like, why didn't I know Stefan when I was writing my book? He would have been such a wonderful person to speak to about all these issues. And I think that we end up with some very similar concerns. I can say that after reading your book and the research I've done. I'm just pulling up my notes really quick. Okay, I don't have my notes, so I'll do this off the top of my head. First of all, thank you for getting between the M and the M prime. I think as I was trying to conceptualize the relations between the financial sector and ecological imperialism, like you said, a lot of the literature is very broad brushed. The amount that I wrote, which is way smaller than yours, I just wrote a chapter in a book, 2 chapters, is totally broad brushed. And so when I was reading yours, it was really great to have it localized, to talk about the geography, to talk about the specific financial actors that are involved. And so it was really great to see that level of detail, which is not usually there. I thought the remark you made about Africa not being the center of the land grabbing was very different from what a lot of the land grabbing literature talked about. I really appreciated what you talked about with the state and how the state is both can facilitate investment, but can also be a site of contestation. And I thought that this was an important point that you brought up. I thought that one thing to keep in mind with the state being also a seat of contestation is that one thing I had wanted to address is wanted you to address more is how much of the fact that how much resistance had to happen on the ground before the state took a more obstructing role with capital. And if it wasn't really for that on the ground resistance that you brought up, because you do bring up how a lot of the investments in land fell through because of the resistance from on the ground, what do you think would have happened? I mean, where would Africa be at right now if it wasn't for those local resistances? And I bring that up because I've just been working with some other scholars who are involved in the land grabbing issue in Africa, some of them as activists. And they bring up the role of local communities as well as NGOs, as well as that intense international protest. So it's the push and pull, you know, between capital wanting in many ways to keep going, the ceaseless accumulation of capital, and then that resistance from below, and the kind of counterfactual we have to ask ourselves, what would be happening if the resistance wasn't there? Other things that I noticed in the book, I think that one of the critiques I would have is just a structural critique, and in terms of the book, and I just wrote a book myself, so I know it's an incredibly arduous process, and there were things I would have changed about my own writing. So it's hard to get everything all at once, but one critique I had is you come up with really insightful things right at the end of the book. I felt like in chapter 9, and I felt in many ways when it comes to the bigger theoretical implications for your book, I was waiting to hear about them almost until chapter 9, especially when it came to sustainability. And you brought up a really important point that I was searching for in my own research, which is how does that short-termism of finance drive ecological destruction? And also the main thing that you bring up in your website, the global return society. So these really big issues of, first, where is that surplus coming from? Who are the laborers who are the workers, or the ecological surplus, where is it coming from? And then who are the returns going to? That's such a big, it's such an important point. And the other part is the driving of the ecological destruction. And also just the fact that finance is fundamental to driving ecological imperialism and ecological destruction, because all of the extractivism that we see happening is being funded by somebody. And so some of the issues that I was struggling with in my own research are things like, okay, what about that short-termism? What about how liberalized financial markets are across the world, so that if you are a company, you can literally borrow from hundreds of sources at this point. And you're totally right. A big part of it is pension funds. I've totally seen that in my own work. And I don't want to go on too much because I know we're allotted just a short period, but I wanted to end with a quote that I had found from Marx when I was working on finance from his Capital Volume 3. And he said that the financial sector actually brings together land rent, it brings together non-reinvested industrial profits, it brings together the savings of workers, and it acts as a centralizing force, which is then put into the hands as a money power of a specific class. So we have a lot of things going on here. We have this kind of centralizing tendency, centralizing capacity of the financial sector put into the hands of a specific class of people as a money power. And as we can see, it's put around the world. And when it comes to things, not just farming, but when it comes into this kind of pushing of unsustainable growth and extractivisms, this has real ecological consequences. And I felt there was a lot about your work that overlapped with that. But it always happens as scholars. We always get interested in what we're interested in, and we always want more of that from other scholars. But overall, I wish I had known you as I was writing about finance, because you would have been such a wonderful resource. And I really enjoyed reading your book. And I hope to read more. I hope that you put out more along these lines, and I will enjoy having your website as a resource as well.
Thank you, Mariko.
Thank you, Mariko. And now, Joseph, if you're ready, yes.
Yes, so thank you, Chair. And yeah, so thanks, Stefan. As mentioned earlier on, this was a long book to read. Interesting, for a long time I've been used to just reading articles and some book chapters, and not going the full length of books. The first time I was forced to sit and read, this book all through. Actually, 1.5 times, not once, because as you know, my background has not been too much on investments, but rather taking the broader perspective of capital, right? Of the role of capital, looking at the historical trajectory of capitalism. And obviously we rhyme together, when it comes to certain ideas of dependency, structuralists, of course, the ideas of David Harvey. But then I found in this book that you have sent the perspective much more deeper, because then for the first time you kind of digress from our 1960 to 90s, typical political economy analysis, by including much deeper insights with your experiences of the story from the other side. I think the story from the other side seems to have found some articulation in your work, much better than what you would find from the land grab literature. And of course, in my work, where because companies have often closed their doors to us, we never get to tell their story. So my work, for instance, doesn't have the kind of insight that you have, that comparative perspective that you give from the view of the investor, right? We have often had superficial entry into the investor's world. We see more of what happens to local communities, to national economic systems, right? The changes that take place, but in very few instances do you really have that rare insight that you provide. And I think delving into finance-gone farming, as you say, offers a unique opportunity to study the emergence, the evolution, and production of a new social space. And I think this is very important, a new social space, and that is precisely what you've done. And you call it an asset class, right? Obviously, not running away from your roots, right? Of a class analysis, through which you say money is used to create more money on behalf of the better off, right? Better off parts of the world, which are able to participate in capital markets. In other parts of the book, you have also clearly articulated that, yes, it isn't only finance from other parts of the world, but also you have a significant proportion of domestic investors, right, who are also part of the assetization, right, of farmlands, of finance-gone capital. And I think what you've done, the historical depth that you have given, in terms of how changes have taken place over time is very elucidating. And I was particularly interested in the New Zealand case, right? To see how the role of the state or the perspective of the state with regards to investments, the role of investments in propelling national development, which has often been assumed in neoliberal analysis to be a straightforward jacket, tend to have changed in the case of New Zealand. That at one point, yes, they are encouraging it. At one point, they come to a realization, no, this is bad for us, and then you have the discourse, about how, the same discourse as we've always put from the perspective of Africa, right? That, this is a neo-colonial thing. This is, a foreignization, right? And loss of, of our national sovereignty and what have you. So it was surprising to see this same discourse rhyme. And I think even in the American case, you also mentioned a short, history of the Americas. And I think even there too, you tend to have this. Though over there, of course, we can say that was an empty land, in quotes, that people invaded and simply threw spears and determined what land to take, But then you have this same, the states, the state's perception, of the importance of these investments tends to change historically. And I think this is something we often miss in our analysis. We always take one point, right? And that one point seems to be just from the Washington consensus, right? That, hey, come on, the World Bank says, you guys, you need to invite those who have the technology, who have the money, right? And who are these? That is finance, right? Global companies. If you take the historical development, these were multinational companies. And then, of course, all of a sudden, the big multinational company changes into some invisible finance. You never know who the actors really are, pension funds, what have you. We in Africa will often think that, oh yeah, this company, Blue Skies. But the truth is that you don't even know what is Blue Skies. You don't know who are behind it, right? It's a whole invisible force of actors. And I think this, you have done this very well, but you've tackled a much complex situation because there are several perspectives coming in here. You have got history coming in. You have got a current situation. You have got some kind of turmoil within the discourse itself, even as of now, right? And then you have the bigger players against the land grab. It looks like the land grab, the majority here seems to be those against it, right? Not those for it. And you tend to give a much, I will call it neutral, I say neutral because you present both sides. And one can see that it isn't, when it comes to winners and losers, as we do in political economy, it's not, you don't just identify one particular bunch of losers, right? You see different contexts within which we have different kinds of losers. And there are examples of companies, of course, that have also been losers, right? But of course, the difference might be in the case of how global capital functions. They have insurance, right? Probably that might cushion them compared to local populations, right? Then, of course, you have got the backing of the state and all those. Just to give an example, Ghana, we are going through what we call a debt exchange right now. We are in real tumultuous, situation right now, whereby we are losing a lot of our investments because the government cannot pay. And therefore, domestic investors have been asked to ask off a lot of their money. So if you have 1 million Ghana cedis, you probably are going to lose, a quarter of it, right? Now, this is not playing out the same way for foreign debtors, right? And you can see that is the same dynamics as you have when you have, finance, coming into different countries and how it operates. And generally, I think that basically the analysis that we then present towards the end, that tends to now engage with the land grab literature, right? Tells us how important context is and how the Tanzanian case, for instance, shows a typical African story. And that typical African story has got a historical background. And of course, the current economic situation, the current political dispensation, right? The current political class and how they engage with foreign capital all come into play. So I think you've engaged with these things very well. Though it's quite complex, you need to, when you read through over 200 and something page book with, all the different, jigsaws that you have to put together, but thanks a lot. Though, of course, I've read 2 other articles on this earlier on, and I think those are much more shorter and they deal exactly with one theme. And yes, I think this was a wonderful book, and thanks for inviting me to review it.
On that note of being a wonderful book, may I now ask members of the public to ask questions or make comments, and then I can invite Professor Ouma to respond to the 2 sets of questions and comments, one set by the members of the panel, and then a second by members of the audience. Although I saw, did I see Anna's hand go up, or no? No, okay. So if there is any question, I have not seen any question in the chat box. I haven't seen any hand up. I thought I saw my colleague Gutu. Okay. Okay, there isn't a hand up yet. So I think, Stefan, you have the floor now.
Yeah, thank you to everybody for this very rich feedback. All the points you mentioned, I've never heard them before. I just want to underline the value of the comments, and it really corresponds to this idea of a boundary object. I mean, this applies to many subjects, but I think the global land grab is such a huge phenomenon that you cannot capture it from the single perspective. You need different positionalities of researchers, you need different methodologies, you need different theoretical angles. So that is one thing. And the other, I think, is, before I go into your comments, to acknowledge the specific nature of the book. It was really meant as a short book in a way, and it was meant to be an accessible book, and also have a style where you say what I always wanted to know, but no one has really written about it in depth. So the chapters also follow this kind of logic. So at the end, I hope that it would be valuable not just to researchers, but also activists and policymakers. But that, of course, does not mean that there are no shortcomings there, for instance, when it comes to activism, that both Mariko and Anna have flagged in their responses. So let me go through some of your points. I start with Anna. I think you are right in the sense that this value dimension, the glue that holds together the financial industry, and I make the argument that you have to understand this glue, and that you have to understand that the decisions they are making are based on certain norms, and these norms can be changed, so they are not executing some subliminal, eternal type of logic that we can't change. They execute what society has structured for them. So there's a whole chapter on this, because I felt it's not very strongly represented in the literature that usually frames finance to be amoral. And now they're also going for land and food, and just another proof for their amorality. So I think there was a political impetus here, but I fully agree with you that eventually we cannot escape a kind of materialist and class-based take on this. And I now shift to the New Zealand context and labor a little bit more. Obviously, many of the financial investors are harvesting and capitalizing on something that had started much earlier. The farm labor regime, the current one that is so central to many of these highly efficiently run farms that often operate with migrant labor, this is not a product of the finance capitalists coming to New Zealand only recently. This is a product of the post-1984 consolidation and professionalization of the farming industry. And so these labor relations have to be seen within that context. And there are obviously a number of controversies also related to this within your country. So I think this is an example where class comes in, but I also think when it comes to the sheer distribution of land and the families from which some of these brokers for global capital come and hail from, fathers have been federated farmers presidents and so on and so forth. So there's a whole very local story to this that has a class dimension that didn't make it into the book because it would have become a much larger book. And then, of course, there's the Maori case, you know, the big chunk of the population in your country, and they feature only very sparsely in the book, but they obviously have a lot of land themselves and may have stakes in this game or be sources of resistance. And Winston Peters, the former New Zealand first head, and I'm not sure whether he still is, but he was part of a quite strange government starting from 2017. He's a Maori, obviously not representative, but he was clearly anti-foreign investment into land with the New Zealand First Party. So this is also something I didn't cover well, but we should. And the last thing, and this is now a bridge to Mariko, who would have wished for a deeper engagement with the state. Part of a kind of materialist critique of the state and class relationships for me would also be the importance of capital gains. So the regime in New Zealand is one where capital gains, and people couldn't really explain to me when I talked to them, has been firmly part of the farming cultures for a very, very long time. And capital gains are not taxed in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this makes it very attractive for foreign investors, but also for local big-time farmers. And for me, the central question is always what kind of class relations and political configurations allow for a taxation regime where capital gains, which favor a certain group of people, they can serve small people, homeowners, small farmers, of course, as well, but they can also serve big financial interests very well. So this is where I would build a bridge to a more materialist critique of the state. I should say that there is work accompanying my own work that offers a much deeper take on the state. So Tobias Klinge, my former master's students, wrote this paper on the micropolitics of foreign investments in farmland in your country, Anna, and he really unravels how the Overseas Investment Office works and puts that in historical perspective. So some of that made it into the book. Other bits and pieces didn't make it in. It's not a fully materialist critique, but it's a much deeper take on this. Same for Tanzania. That was never published, but I had a keen interest in reconstructing the current investment regime in Tanzania and the kinds of class interests that shaped especially the later 2000s, where some of the key lending ground for these investors was prepared. But obviously you have to go back a bit further into the 1990s, where many of the former state farms then ended up either in some state institution as a trustee, or was given to some private individuals who were the previous owners. So there are very murky histories in many cases, but obviously also this has a class dimension. So I'm grateful for both Anna and Mariko's comments here. Maybe a last point, the financial sector. I agree with you. These old takes on the financial sector and who holds financial power are really, really interesting, money power. But I think the risk is that it can correspond too quickly, not automatically, with this 1% type of critique, which has its own merits, the 1%. But it then often sidelines that the 1% are often administering the money of and assets of another, I don't know, depending where you are, 20, 30, 40% of the population. So I think it's valuable that they articulate these other many money interests and they hold then the money power and make investment decisions. But there's still, you know, smaller people behind those 1%. And this is then a much more uncomfortable debate, because this is sometimes about people who have no other choice than depositing their money with a pension fund or, you know, an insurance company who then invests it in another part of the world. Then to Joseph, a last point. I mean, I was very grateful for your reading and comments. I think you showed us very nicely where you come from. And also, you know, this is the shortcoming of the book, the communities, processes of social stratification in the countryside, conflicts, maybe also hidden forms of resistance in communities against these forms of investments. And it's the old problem, which side are you on? It is very, very hard to do work on labor and capital, and communities is where labor goes to sleep, in Harvey's words, in a symmetrical way. Because at a certain point in time, if you are perceived to be too close to one side, the others won't talk to you anymore. So I had to make a kind of decision. Once I take the investors and farm operators as my prime entry point, it will become much, much more difficult then to, you know, leave the farm and wait until the workers come out and then talk to them and then expect that I get another interview. Fortunately, and this is, and here I'm closing, this is also something under the boundary objects framework or heading. Fortunately, many of my cases, other people have done studies on communities, especially in Tanzania. So there is more work that can be aligned with my own case studies. And the website is also meant to balance out these shortcomings of my own book. So in total, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to provide my own response to your comments soon. And yeah, we hope to have a good printed version of this.
In the meanwhile, Stefan, there's a question in the chat box by Rachel.